Good. Okay, keep an eye on it. Make sure that it doesn't go off in the middle. Okay, we are up to Shmuel Bet, Perek Zayin. We're going to do Zayin Chet and Tet today. So Perek Zayin, David HaMelech tells Natan HaNavi, one of the Nevi'im that was close with David, he tells him that he wants to build a house for the Aron Hashem, meaning, in other words, he wants to build the Beit HaMikdash. So Natan originally answers him and says, Lech aseh ki Hashem imcha. Go, do it, because Hashem is with you. Because Natan knew that Hashem was totally with David. However, that night, Natan gets a nevuah, gets a prophecy from God, and tells him to tell David that, no, sorry, you, David, are not going to be the one to build the Beit HaMikdash. And Hashem says it like, have I asked anybody, all these years I've been, since we got into Eretz Yisrael, have I ever asked anybody to build me a bayit? Doesn't mean that there isn't a mitzvah to build a Beit HaMikdash. That's going to happen. However, not yet. Not yet. When Hashem wants, He's going to decide who's going to build the Beit HaMikdash. And then Hashem tells Natan, to tell David that, to list for him basically all the favors, all the good things that Hashem has done for David. And in effect, what he's saying is that, I've done you all these good things, be happy with that. I understand you want to build a Beit HaMikdash, but that's not going to be for you. That's going to be your son, as we'll see in a minute. So it goes through history a little bit in the next few psukim from Chet till Yud Aleph, Yud Bet. I just want to point out one interesting pasuk at the Tet. The end of Tet, it says, "Ve'asiti lecha shem gadol kishem hagdolim asher ba'aretz." I gave you a great name, a famous name. Everyone knows you, like the name of the Gedolim asher ba'aretz. There's a sefer that the Chida, one of the great Sephardic scholars, put out where he basically, it's biographies on Gedolim, and it's called Shem HaGdolim, and it's based on this pasuk. Shem HaGdolim, the name of the great ones. So anyway, Hashem tells him all this, and then he tells him, your son, who's going to take over after you, he's going to build a Beit HaMikdash. Now it's very interesting. It does not say here explicitly why Hashem is so against David building the Beit HaMikdash, and only his son, of course we know that's Shlomo, is going to do the job. But in Divrei Hayamim, Aleph, when it goes through this same basic story, there it says explicitly the reason is because David spilled a lot of blood. Not that he did anything wrong by doing that. He was supposed to do that. He was fighting the battles of Hashem. He was killing out the enemies of Hashem. However, it's not so mat'im. It doesn't jive. It doesn't go together that someone who spilled so much blood should also build the Beit HaMikdash, which is a house of peace. Yes?
Wasn't this also the same reason that David was supposed to take over after Shaul because Shaul was more bloody and needed more peace? Or was it like
no.
David was more bloody when it
No, it wasn't anything with bloody. The problem is that Shaul didn't do the job, didn't do what he was told. He was not as loyal to Hashem as David is. So then he says, Hashem says that and your son, his kingship is going to be forever. And even if he sins, I'm not going to totally get rid of him or like I did with Shaul, I despised him. I'm never going to despise that line of kingship. Is going to eventually, and we know that's Mashiach ben David is eventually going to be from David and Shlomo all the way down the line.
Especially useful in Shlomo's later time.
Right, exactly. That's what Pasuk Yudal it says. Even if he sins, and Shlomo did sin, even if he sins, okay, let's not overdo it. We'll see when we get there. Hashem is going to punish him, but not totally despise him forever as he did with Shaul. And then Hashem promises David that his kingdom will be lanetzach. David Melech Yisrael Chai v'Kayam. It's forever and ever. David's kingship. There will never be another line of royalty in Am Yisrael besides through David. Now, after this whole nevuah that Natan gets, he gives it over to David the next day. And David, basically, most of the rest of the chapter is David praising God for what he just told him. And he belittles himself. He says how little I am, how I don't deserve such great promises, etc., etc. Very famous pasuk of Gimel. He says, "Umi kam chai Yisrael goy echad ba'aretz asher holchu elokim liftod olam," etc., etc. Who is like your nation, O Israel? That we say every day, every Shabbos and Shabbos Mincha, right? Umi kam chai Yisrael goy echad ba'aretz. It's based on this pasuk. So again, you have to read through these psukim a little bit poetic. It's prophetic and poetic. But basically, David here is praising and blessing God for the good news that his kingship will last forever. Then David prays that Hashem should really fulfill this promise that he gave him, that he should have an everlasting kingship, etc., etc. And that is the rest of the chapter. Again, we really summarized it very quickly, but because you have to really see the psukim, each one, and understand exactly how David praises God and what exactly his prayer was. But that I'm going to leave to you. We move on to Perek Chet, chapter 8. He goes back to the wars. David smites the Plishtim. And then in Pasuk Bet, it says, Vayachet Moav. He smites the Moavites. Now here, it doesn't explain why, by the Plishtim, it says they came to fight the Jews. So that makes sense. David's going to defend the Jewish people. But what does Moab have to do with anything? So the Mefarshim explain, if you remember all the way back in Shmuel Aleph, David asked the king of Moab to watch his parents and his brothers while he goes out, until he can establish his kingdom. We never saw what happened there. It just sort of like ended. We never saw the end of the story. But the Mefarshim say that the king of Moab killed David's parents and his brothers. And therefore, David here is getting them back, is taking vengeance for his parents. And that's why he smites the Moabites, but he does it in a very interesting way. He measures them with a cheva, which means he put them out. He put them out in a row on the floor, lied them down, and he measured with a string, with a rope, a measuring rope. And 2/3 or 2 chavalim were to be killed and 1 to live. Basically, he would measure 2 lengths of the rope. They're going to be killed. Another length, they could stay alive. 2, 1, 2, 1. Basically, he killed out 2/3 of the entire population of Moab, and the rest became his servants, meaning they had to pay him tribute, they had to pay him taxes every year. David then fights against Hadadezer, the king of Tzova. And he totally routs him, and also cuts off the legs of all of his horses, or most of his horses, I should say, and he only kept 100. So the Mefarshim explain why. Because the Torah says explicitly that a king is not allowed to have too many horses. Not allowed to have too much gold and silver, horses or wives. So wives, we know David HaMelech had 18. Horses, also there's a limit. And there were so many horses that he basically conquered that it would have been too many. It would have been against the Torah to keep them. So therefore he chopped off their legs. Then Aram, the nation Aram, came to help out Hadadezer. They came to fight against David with Hadadezer. And David also smites them. And they also, like we saw before about Moab, they become servants paying tribute to David. David takes all the gold, and there's a lot of brass or copper in the cities of Hadadezer, and he brings it all to Yerushalayim. Toi, the king of Hamat, was an enemy of Hadadezer. They always fought each other. So when David conquered Hadadezer, again, who was the king of Tzova, Toi, the king of Hamat, was thrilled. His enemy was just killed, so he sent his son Yoram to King David to bless him and to thank him and to bring a gift for the fact that he killed his enemy Hadadezer. David takes all this gold and silver that he brought him, and he also brings that to Yerushalayim, meaning all of the gold and silver and the loot and the booty that he got, the spoils of war that he got, he brought it to Yerushalayim. It was all going to be used for the building of the Beit HaMikdash eventually. Meaning, even though David was just told that he's not going to be the one to build the Beit HaMikdash, he did all the preparations for the building of the Beit HaMikdash, which allowed his sons, right?
He gathered all the raw materials.
Right, he got a lot of the raw materials, and as we're going to see, he also bought the place, Har Bayit. He bought that. That's later on.
Why would David Melech have to buy the place? Who owned Har Bayit?
So there was a Yevusi, it was a Jebusite, because Yerushalayim belonged to the Yevusim until we conquered it. Yeah. So David Dafka wanted to pay for it. So there's a very famous midrash that said there's three, it's very relevant to this week's parsha. There are three places where the Goyim cannot taunt us and say, these are our places. And they are Maharat HaMachpelah, this week's parsha, where Avram paid cold cash for it. There's Har Bayit, where it says that David paid cash for it. He didn't want to just take it and conquer it, because then the Goyim will say, hey, you stole it from us. He wanted to pay money for it, so that no one would have an excuse and say, oh, it doesn't belong to you Jews. And the third is, anyone know? Shechem. Yaakov bought Shechem, Nablus, right? Shechem from Hamor, Shechem, right? So that's also a place that the Goyim cannot or should not taunt us and say we stole it from them. Anyway, so that's why David had to buy it. We go back to the end of the Perek, Perchet. All of the nations around are now serving David. David has established his kingdom over all of Israel. And very important pasuk Tedvav, Vayimloch David al kol Yisrael, Vayhi David osem mishpat u'tzdaka l'chol amo. He wasn't one of these kings, a tyrant, and just give me all the power or whatever. He did tzedakah u'mishpat. His task, his tafkid was to do righteousness and justice for the people. The parak ends with a list of all of David's officers, his main people, and that are his servants, I guess you'd call them. There's Yoav, who is the army general. There's Yehoshaphat. There's Tzadok and Achimelech, the Kohanim. There's Sarayah, who is the Sofer, whatever that means. Sofer probably means the scribe, right? And Benayahu ben Yehoyada vehakreti v'apleti. So that's a phrase that's going to come up a lot. What is the kreti and the pleti? So most of the Farshim explain al pi pshat, according to the pshat, it's the archers and the shooters. So Benayahu ben Yehoyada was in charge of all the sharpshooters, basically. But Chazal darshan it that it's referring to the Urim V'Tumim. The Kreti and the Pleti are the Urim V'Tumim, right? That Shem Hashem that's in the breastplate of the Kohen, that he's able to ask questions and get answers from Hashem. So Benayahu ben Yehoyada was in charge of the Kreti and the Pleti. And then it says Bnei David Kohanim Hayu. That's really strange. Bnei David were Kohanim. How could that be? David is not a Kohen. So they explain that Kohanim means officers, means special people, high-ranking people, not actual Kohanim. The last parak for today, parak Tet. David wants to do chesed for Yehonatan. Yehonatan ben Shaul, his great friend who was killed in battle. He wants to do chesed. He wants to know, are there any descendants, anyone alive from his family? So he asks somebody, Tziva. Oh, so he finds out that there was a servant of Shaul named Tziva, and he asks him if he calls him to come, and he says to him, is there anybody alive from the family? And Tziva says, yes, there is a son of Yehonatan, whose name is Mephibosheth. You remember we had that one pasuk a few parakim ago, and I said, don't worry, we're going to need this information later on. That's what it's for. And he was Nechei Raglayim. Remember, he was Mephibosheth was lame. He couldn't walk properly. So David says, okay, I want you to bring him to me. He was at the time, he was in a place he was by a family, Machir ben Amiel. He was the one who was taking care of him, I guess. And David said, I want you to bring him to me, and because I want to do chesed for Yonatan's family. And therefore he says to Mephibosheth, right? Mephibosheth comes, he bows to David, and David says, I am going to do you chesed for the sake of your father Yehonatan. And he says two things. First of all, I'm going to return to you all the fields of Shaul, your father, which means your grandfather. What does that mean? Why did David have the fields of Shaul? So there's a whole tumult amongst the Mefarshim why David deserved to have it. Either because a king is allowed to take whatever he wants, as we saw back in Shmuel Aleph, that a king has power and he felt that it belonged to him, so he took it. Others say is because Shaul's household were mored b'malchut, like Ishbosheth, the fact that he became king, he knew that David was anointed as a king. He should have said, no, I'm not the king, he's the king. So a mored b'malchut, someone who rebels against the king, deserves death, and all of his possessions are hefker. They don't belong to him anymore. So therefore David took it. It could be that he took it because, don't forget, David was married to Michal, who was a survivor of Beit Shaul. He felt that it belonged to him. He didn't know that there was another son, that there was another Mephibosheth was alive. And therefore now he's telling him, I'm going to give you it all back. You are a survivor of Beit Shaul. It belongs to you. I'm going to give it all to you back. And secondly, you're going to always eat by my table. You're going to be a ben bayit by me. You're going to always have your meals with me. So Mephibosheth, of course, is overjoyed, and he thanks the king. David commands Tziva, this Eved. He says, you are going to work the land, because I just gave back all the land, right? You're going to work the land, and you're going to use that and feed Mephibosheth's son, who we're only going to be introduced to at the very end of the perek, whose name is Micha. You're going to give him, whatever you get from that field, you give to Micha. But Mephibosheth himself, you don't have to give it to him because he's going to be eating by me. He's going to be on my table. So Tziva, this servant of Beit Shaul, he agrees to all these conditions, and he says, for sure. I mean, like up until now, I gave Mephibosheth everything, and now you're going to feed him. Perfect. Let's look at the very end of the perek, just the last two psukim. Ule Mephibosheth, Yud Bet and Yud Gimel. Ule Mephibosheth ben Katan u'shmo Micha. He had a small son whose name was Micha. He was the one, as I said, that Tziva is going to be feeding. V'chol moshav beit Tziva avadim leMephibosheth. And Tziva had many children himself and many servants himself. The servant had servants. So all this is going to be used to feed those people. Mephibosheth Yoshe b'Yerushalayim. But Mephibosheth himself, since he was lame, he couldn't just come back and forth. So David gave him a place to stay in Yerushalayim. Ki al shulchan hamelech tamid hu ochel. He's always going to eat. He always eats by the table of the king. V'hu piseach shtei raglav. And he was, as we said, both his legs didn't really work, which explains why he was in Yerushalayim. Since he couldn't really travel so easily, so he stayed in Yerushalayim, and he didn't, and he was always fed by the king. Yeah.
Why does it need to mention that he was lame again?
I explain because here it's important to know, to explain why Mephibosheth had to live in Yerushalayim. He could have lived somewhere else and come in, for his food. He didn't because he was lame in 2 feet, and therefore he couldn't get here. He couldn't get to Yerushalayim so easily. All right.